Hi, everyone. I'm Ron Jaffa, president of the UVA Club of Fairfield, Westchester. I'm in Stamford, Connecticut. Our club covers Fairfield County, Westchester County, on the outskirts of New York City. And we welcome the UVA clubs of Boston, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Hartford. Thank you for being here with us. And we also appreciate the Boston Club a couple of weeks ago having extended an invitation to our Northeastern clubs for the Zoom session with John Unsworth, Dean of the UVA Libraries. It was a very enjoyable event. Also, thank you tonight to Robin Stafford, our REO, for all her hard work, and the Office of Engagement for putting this together, and most of all to Bill Antholis for taking time out of his busy schedule to be our speaker tonight. We had planned on having him live in Stamford this evening, and then circumstances otherwise caused us to postpone that, but we appreciate and are happy he can still be with us tonight and at least give us the benefit of his thoughts. Mr. Antholis serves as director and CEO of the Miller Center, a nonpartisan affiliate of the University of Virginia that specializes in presidential scholarship, public policy, and political history. Immediately prior, he served as managing director at the Brookings Institution from 2004 to 2014, a nonprofit research organization where he managed 5 research programs, more than 400 employees, 4 offices, and multiple university partnerships. During his tenure, Brookings was named top think tank in the world and top think tank in the United States for 7 years consecutively by the University of Pennsylvania's Think Tank and Civil Society program. From 1995 to 1999, Mr. Antholis served at the White House during the administration of President Bill Clinton, where he was Director of International Economic Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council and National Economic Council, where he served as chief staff person for the G8 summits in 1997 and 1998. He was also deputy director of the White House Climate Change Policy Team. At the State Department, he served on the policy planning staff and in the Economic Affairs Bureau. Mr. Antholis earned a PhD in politics from Yale University in 1994 and a BA with honors in government and foreign affairs at UVA in 1986. At Virginia, he was an Eccles Scholar, Phi Beta Kappa, and his thesis in the Politics Honors Program, co-written with fellow 1986 college graduate Stephen Grand, won the Stevenson Award for the best honors thesis in the Department of Politics. He was also a disc jockey at WUVA, a finalist in the UVA intramural boxing tournament, which I found very interesting. Maybe he can enlighten us a little bit on that, and a member of Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity. He's with us tonight to talk about what happens next, disruption, crisis management, and democracy in 2020. And he will answer some of our questions after he is done. So feel free during the course of his talk, you'll see a question and answer button. You can submit your questions. Michael Getz with the engagement office will submit those questions to Bill after he's done. So thank you for joining. And with that, I'll hand it off to Bill.
Well, thank you, Ron, and Michael and Robin for pulling this together. And I'm also joined by our colleague, Kelly McCaskill, who's also a graduate of the college, who now works with us at the Miller Center. It's not often I get to pull out my runner-up trophy from intramural boxing, but this is really a treat. And I'm just sad that we weren't able to do this in person, having been born and raised in the New York City area. I came to UVA as an undergrad, but then also spent 5 years in grad school, as Ron mentioned, up the road in New Haven. So this is a homecoming of sorts, and look forward to getting to do this in person. Tonight I've been asked to talk for about 20 minutes. That'll leave us a little more than a half hour for discussion, which I really look forward to. As you know from the title, and I'm going to share my screen in a second, we've been living in a disruptive age, and that was the case before President Trump was elected. Everything from the rise of social media to electronic trading, globalization. There have been so many different things that have driven disruption over the last 25 years, where it's not just the volume, but the velocity of change has been ever present. But the current president has embraced the concept of disruption. And I say that as somebody that, though I served in the Clinton administration, I'm now the director of a center that studies the presidency. We've been around for about 45 years. And since the beginning, the Miller Center got into studying the presidency. I was an undergrad at UVA about 10 years into its run. We look at it through a number of different lenses: historical, constitutional, public management, law, business, and we try to take our personal views out of things and just try to understand the various dimensions of the presidency. We've worked closely with officials from each of the last 10 presidencies, and we've known and worked with senior Trump officials, including one who joined us as a senior fellow a few years ago before going back into service under Vice President Pence as his chief of staff right now. So the presentation that I'm going to give draws from that big body of work that we've built for some time. I'm going to share my screen now and walk through a number of slides that are based on research at the Miller Center that we started about 5 years ago. And in the lower right-hand corner of this scene, you'll see a little badge that says the first year project. In 2015, actually, about 2 years before President Trump was sworn in, not knowing who that president would be, we tried to understand different dimensions of the presidency. Mark Twain, somebody who once lived in Connecticut, is said to have coined the phrase, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And what we wanted to do and what we set out to do was to understand in these different 5 dimensions how a new president tries to come into office when they are at the height of their political mandate. They just won election, they've got the public support behind them, but they're at the depth of their experience. Every new president has to assemble a team, establish processes, pick their priorities, manage politics, particularly with Congress, and then promote their personal popularity. So let me start walking through these different dimensions, starting with the personal. The personnel, that is the basics of governing. Every president starts by establishing a team. This chart shows how quickly previous presidents have moved to establish their cabinets. The 5 most important cabinet agencies, particularly if you have a crisis, are these ones. And if you can see my cursor up here in the upper right corner, State Department, the Defense Department, the Justice Department, HHS, Treasury, the CIA, and Homeland Security are also critical. So what you see are the first 5 badges. In white are the cabinet secretaries, and in blue are the deputy secretaries. And you'll see that President Trump moved pretty quickly to put in his cabinet, even with a disruptive transition. Where he lagged, however, was installing deputies. That is the blue badge that you'll see here. He had 1 deputy installed by his first 100 days, whereas previous presidents get most of their deputies in. Below that, and what this slide shows is the major cabinet agencies, even beyond the top 5, but you'll see here in blue, I've highlighted the top 5, and then in red, just highlighted Homeland Security. What that indicates is what percentage of deputy and assistant secretary level people have been confirmed. And the reason that that's important is if you are managing a crisis at any moment, you want your people installed and also want them to have been vetted by Congress, because Congress and therefore the public will have greater trust in them. And what you see here is an administration that is historically behind schedule, and we've flagged Homeland Security at 35% of assistant secretary level positions having been confirmed at this point. So, for instance, yesterday the president announced a more restrictive immigration policy. He needs to have his people in place to manage that new policy. Whoops, sorry. Beyond that, what this slide shows is that cabinet turnover in the Trump administration has exceeded all recent administrations in a first term. And he still has 1 year to go. It's the only administration to replace a cabinet secretary in the first year, and there were 2 in this case, with 5 more replacements in the second year. But it's not just picking a cabinet, it's getting them to work together. That's the role of the White House staff, to manage process. So this is President Trump's senior White House staff in his first week in office. In addition to the president and vice president, you have Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, Senior Advisor Steve Bannon, Spokesperson Sean Spicer, National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. During the transition period, that is between Election Day and Inauguration Day, this group of people participated in a role-playing exercise sitting alongside the outgoing Obama administration. They had to walk through what they would do if there was an outbreak of a novel influenza epidemic. So one of the important things about turnover is even if this team learned those lessons, by the summer of the first year, all of these staff, other than the president and the vice president, would be replaced. Having a well-oiled machine managed by the White House has become the goal of most presidents. I want to emphasize all presidents struggle to get this to work. The percentage of turnover in the Trump White House, however, has been higher than the past 5 administrations. Here, the core issue, however, is not total percentage, which tends to approach 80% in most White Houses. Remember, these are hard jobs. Most White House staff serve for about 2 years because they work 24/7, 365 during their term in office. The relevant numbers are the first and second years where all those critical lessons are learned. And if a crisis emerges in the second or third year, they're prepared to respond. Here, Trump's first and second year each were crippled by nearly 40% turnover. What's quite striking is that in many cases, he's on his 3rd replacement, and sometimes that is his 4th officials, and in sometimes even 5th officials. So for instance, in the chief of staff role, we have a 4th chief of staff and the communications director, a 5th communications director. It turns out the current Deputy National Security Advisor, Matthew Pottinger, is quite a seasoned China hand, which quite came in handy in this crisis. He was one of the first to alert the president of the outbreak. The problem was that he didn't know the system particularly well and wasn't able to relay that as quickly both up and down the chain of command. But okay, the president now has his team in place. He can advance his priorities. These are President Trump's priorities when he came into office. You see the column there on the left. I won't go through all of them. They were a combination of domestic, economic, and trade promises, and they were quite clear, and he's advanced many of them. His signature legislative wins have been in cutting taxes and passing a new NAFTA, or the replacement of NAFTA, the USMCA. On the rest of his priorities, he's largely used executive action on a range of these other issues, mostly economic, which led to very robust economic growth, that is, until the first quarter of this year. He also advanced his foreign policy agenda, which was, as we all know, to put America first. His national security strategy, released in December of his first year, was quite specific in this regard. The national security strategy, or at least as written, had very tough words in talking about these traditional adversaries: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. His record, or the administration's record, has been a bit of a checkerboard. He's followed through on the tough rhetoric with China and Iran, but somewhat less so with North Korea and Russia. And here again, we have to separate rhetoric from action. With respect to Russia, during the administration's tenure, they've actually passed wider sanctions and have stepped up military assistance to countries like Ukraine. However, he sent mixed signals through his open rhetoric and his various meetings with President Putin from Russia. He has had rockier time with his allies. By most accounts, US relations with NATO and with EU allies are at their weakest since the end of World War II. From trade to security challenges to climate change to immigration to diplomacy with Iran to the coronavirus epidemic, the president sees himself as disrupting the slow, incremental work of multilateralism. There are populist and authoritarian governments within the alliance now in the UK, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, who share his distrust of multilateralism. His own relations with those countries actually varies to some degree, better relations with some, weaker relations with others. Perhaps no relationship has been more contentious among his allies than with Germany. The president and Angela Merkel's mutual disdain has been on regular display. And the coronavirus, or the Wuhan virus as the president liked to call it, has been perhaps the ultimate presentation of all the dimensions of the Trump presidency. White House coordination of the federal agency response has been at times deferential to those agencies rather than top down. Oftentimes you have acting administrators carrying out the president's policy. And what has generally been lacking are clear statements backed up by coordinated action. It is not unusual in a crisis for a president's rhetoric to zigzag a bit, and this president's rhetoric has certainly done that. What's important is that the policies that the president states when he wants to state them are clearly backed up by federal action, and that has been slow to gel in the Trump presidency. Even the Wall Street Journal and Fox News have grown worried about his management of the crisis and have published editorials stating as much. And then there's the politics of managing the Trump presidency, or any presidency, is embedded in a constitutional system of checks and balances. This requires the president to navigate the politics of Pennsylvania Avenue. And while the president has considerable executive power at his disposal, the system is designed to be most powerful, more powerful than executive action when the executive and legislature work together. So one mark of an effective president is working with Congress on the agenda that he in this case seeks to pursue. So how is this president done? This chart shows the list of first-year accomplishments of recent presidents, since we were tracking the first-year project, compared to the Trump presidency. Each president, I should note, faced a different congressional makeup, which often impacts how well a president can do. Presidents Carter, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, and Trump all had Congress controlled by their own party. In contrast, Presidents Reagan and Bush each faced a Democratic-controlled Congress in both houses of Congress. So the Trump administration accomplished the fewest signature legislative wins in their first year, even with Republicans controlling both houses. Now, in the president's defense, many of his defenders would argue, and I would agree in some regard, that both the tax cut regulation and the thing you see pointed here as the Congressional Review Act, which gave the president authority to undo several of the executive orders done by the Obama administration, that those were major, meaningful actions, indicating that the president actually got some wins. What the chart also doesn't demonstrate is the huge number of federal judges that have been confirmed in the Trump presidency in the first year, second year, and third year so far. That said, the small number of wins compared to other presidents is a sign of a president that sees working with Congress as a second or third order priority. And of course, that was before 2018. Like many presidents, Trump has had a significant setback in the 2018 midterm elections. Each dot on this map represents a congressional district. This is the current map. The 234 blue dots are Democrats in the House, and 201 red dots are the GOP. The numbers have changed some due to resignations and switched affiliations, but essentially President Trump and the Republicans lost 41 seats to the Democrats in the 2018 midterm. The president's first 2 years did essentially two things. First, they moved the country to the left, and second, they helped to drive political polarization. Let me start with the second of those. The red arrows here show about 80 congressional districts that moved to the right, that is, became more conservative. That is, in each of these red arrows represents a growing share of votes going to the Republican member of Congress from these districts. For about 80 GOP members, that is less than half of the Republican caucus who were elected or re-elected, their districts became more Republican. Now that's 80 out of 235 districts. the president drove about 350 districts to the left for every single blue arrow you see here. Those congressional districts became more Democratic. Every Democrat who was elected or reelected had a larger share of Democratic vote. But in about 100 districts held by Republicans, the share of people voting for the Democrat also increased. That means that many more Republican districts are less safe for that GOP member. Of course, the biggest difference was that 41 seats switched parties. That includes 36 new women members of Congress. A few of those are quite liberal. All three of those circled here, the squad, won seats that were already held by Democrats. So blue districts became bluer. "22 of the freshman women Democrats won formerly Republican seats. Everyone circled in this picture replaced a Republican member of Congress. These members are almost by definition moderates. Most are in the suburbs and even exurbs. This particularly played out in the recent impeachment hearings. Some Democrats had been calling for the president to be impeached from his first year in office. But that didn't move forward even through the Mueller investigation. The tipping point moment came when 7 freshman members of Congress who had served in national security positions in defense, intelligence, and diplomatic positions came out in favor of an impeachment investigation. They all emphasized their own oaths to protect and defend the Constitution. All 7 are in swing districts, and all voted finally to impeach. 5 of those 7 national security freshmen were part of the 22 new women members of Congress, including one just to the east of us here in Charlottesville, Abigail Spanberger from the Richmond suburbs. Finally, how the president manages his personal approval ratings is an essential barometer of his importance, particularly in a presidential election year. To provide some historical context on re-election, let's look back over the 20th and 21st century. Since 1900, we have had 21 presidents. Of those four, 4 died in office: McKinley and Roosevelt just after being reelected, and Harding and Kennedy before having had a chance. And of course, President Nixon resigned. 12 presidents won a second term. I don't use the term reelected here because 4 of these, of course, Teddy Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Harry Truman, and LBJ were not elected the first time, or at least were not elected president. They were elected vice president. Each of these 12 presidents had a rising economy at his back. Taft, Hoover, Ford, Carter, and Bush all faced slowing economies and lost. In addition to a weak economy, Carter was probably also hurt by the Iran hostage crisis. This chart shows President Trump's popularity. President Trump here has been quite historic. He's the only president since the advent of polling to never register above 50% popularity. It's worth noting that the president has never exceeded 46%, although for a moment, just when coronavirus was breaking, in some polls he got to 47 or 48%. But he's never fallen below 37%. That is the very hard base that continues to support the president. In my view, that gap of 9% between his steady floor and his ceiling, I refer to as not the never Trumpers, but the sometimes Trumpers. That is, these are people who want to vote for the president, but have struggled to do so. This is a very critical block of voting for the president. His reelection rests in getting all of those votes, but as importantly for Republicans, down ballot candidates depend on these voters turning out. The president's strength among the sometimes Trumpers seems to come from his handling of the economy and trade. The chart that I'm showing here is his public opinion polling in early March. And the 2 areas where his approval consistently exceeded 40%, is the economy and on trade. By contrast, on immigration, health policy, foreign policy, voters have been less forgiving. And I've put approve here in red state red and disapprove in blue state blue. Now, the one thing I want to point out here is the final column on the right, the impeachment column, is a somewhat misleading number. That is, what percent of people not approve of removing the president, I'm sorry, approve of the president, but approve of removing the president. And if you ask the question differently, what percent felt that the president's actions were serious enough to merit the proceedings, it's a much higher number against the president and a much lower number in support of the president. But as March turned to April, we could see these numbers themselves starting to adjust. So there was the economy number started moving downward. There was actually a slight uptick in health support for his health policies. But his handling of the coronavirus peaked at around 51% in mid-March and has declined to the low to mid-40s. Two figures here are most important. One is how the president compares with Congress, where he's quite favorable. But here he's even trailing the media, which he likes to criticize, as well as health agencies and, maybe more importantly, governors in these various states. I've switched approval and disapproval to more neutral colors because what's quite striking here is, with the exception of the governor's approval and disapproval ratings, and even there it's complicated, it doesn't break down on pure partisan lines. This next slide comes from, This next slide comes from a Republican pollster named Bruce Melman, who runs a bipartisan polling firm. He lays out the strategies the president is likely to take in the presidential election, given those numbers. I think you can see the slide yourself. The core is to emphasize wartime leadership. He will blame a number of different people for the coronavirus, and he plans to go negative on Vice President Biden, his running mate. Vice President Biden and other Democrats are likely to blame the president for his handling of the crisis, comparing the president's handling to that which has happened in other countries. I should say that these critics should be careful not to criticize the president personally, but to criticize him as commander-in-chief and the policies that he's adopting. They will run as a return to Obama normalcy. And one of the different ways that you will see that play out is you will see, I think, Vice President Biden start to bring forward previous Obama administration figures who are likely to be trusted by the public, perhaps more trusted than some of the Trump figures that have been seen. I think the Vice President Biden will be tough on China, and he will share that rhetorical stance of the president, and he will blame the president for being soft on China. We're also likely to see the vice president supporting bipartisan congressional legislation, protecting jobs, human safety, and direct support for workers. The president will look to manage his popularity, and he will claim the mantle of wartime president. So I'm going to show three slides here. These are three presidents, former presidents who faced national security crises. President Carter, as you can see here, had his popularity decline over time. There was a spike shortly after the hostages were taken in Iran. But as that crisis wore on, and as the effects on the economy of Middle East oil shocks kicked in, the president's popularity declined. President Bush 41 was a wartime president. Again, he had spikes in his popularity, particularly after his handling of the first Gulf War. But as a recession kicked in there as well, his popularity sagged. His popularity improved actually after Election Day, and he finished on Inauguration Day in 1993 when President Clinton was sworn in with his numbers above 50%. And then, of course, President Bush 43 had a major spike in the days after 9/11 and subsequent spikes after Mission Accomplished and the capture of Saddam Hussein. But as that crisis dragged on, as Katrina and the financial crisis kicked in 2008, President Bush's popularity also sagged. So what to watch in the coming days? These are the trends that we're watching at the Miller Center. First is the power of the presidency. And we're seeing a bunch of different trade-offs. First, populism versus the power of career government officials. We're seeing that out at the federal level, as well as at the state and local level. On the economy, as the president tries to open the economy and encourages governors to open the economy, what we're going to see are debates over testing and tracing, particularly personal independence versus trusting and but verifying through various tracing mechanisms. How we work, are we willing to stay online working from home, or are we going to force ourselves back into physical interaction? The supply chain, are we going to go back to a supply chain based on efficiency or one that builds in redundancy and safety? In the health system, are we going to stick to a system that's based on unit profitability, both at the physician and at the hospital level? Or are we going to transition to one that has more systemic capacity and cushion based on the public health practices that we see in many European and Asian societies? And finally, on the national security side, are we going to go back to an era of global interdependence, or are we going to move more towards one based on national self-sufficiency? And then finally, on China, are we going to return to a period of rivalry or one of cooperation? And then lastly, we're also looking and tracking at the electoral system. Again, this is from Bruce Mehlman, but these are the same kinds of issues that we are tracking. What happens if there's a resurgence of COVID in the fall around election time? Are we going to be locking down during the weeks of the election? Are we going to be seeing governor orders for quarantine if there are real hotspots? In Wisconsin, in the Democratic primary, we saw an example of what that might look like. A big issue here is, do voters view themselves voting as a need or a want? Is this like going to the grocery store or going for carry-out food? And then finally, what if we can't determine who won on election night? What if we're back to 2000 and the hanging chads? And a series of other issues like that. So with that, I'll close by saying the president has the team that he has for the duration. I don't think we can see turnover between now and election day. The president can't afford it. If he does things like fire trusted people like Fauci, one suspects that his popularity could decline. The process has been actually gelling and coming together. Will he stick with it, or will he return to a more mercurial form of government? Will he stick to a few priorities, or will he zigzag between now and election day? Will he manage the politics with Capitol Hill and passing subsequent CARES Acts and other emergency relief mechanisms? And then finally, how will he manage himself? Will he demonstrate the kind of compassion and cooperative spirit that a lot of governors are getting rewarded for, or will he stick to his political base and try to divide Democrats? So with that, I look forward to taking your questions and having a full conversation.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Bill. Hi, everyone. This is Michael Getz. I'm the Director for UVA Clubs and Global Engagement in the Office of Engagement at UVA. Bill, thank you so much. That was a terrific presentation. And thanks also for making time to speak with the UVA Club of Fairfield, Westchester. Ron, thanks to you and to the board here of the club in Fairfield, Westchester, and to the many alumni, parents, and friends who are joining us tonight. We're really glad to be together in a not together sort of way. A reminder to everybody who is on the webinar, if you'd like to submit a question, if you could use the Q&A box, it will come my way and I will then submit it to Bill. But Bill, we also had several folks who submitted questions in advance of the program, and I'm gonna also give you a couple of those. A couple of them are related to one of the last points that you made about the November election. There's a bit of a worry around the logistics of it in light of COVID, and if anyone could try some political chicanery around the election as well. What's your read on that, and what could we do to potentially prevent that?
Well, there's been a great number of different efforts, including within the federal government for this. The intelligence agencies, that is Defense Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and other intelligence agencies have been gathering and tracking foreign interference, as have, remember, elections really are conducted at the state and local level. So a lot of local, as well as the FBI, a lot of local enforcement agencies are tracking exactly that kind of thing. We've seen two trends already to try to get ahead of that. That's for the election machinery itself. One is the move to paper ballots everywhere. That is that there is a paper trail for all elections. I think in practically every state and in almost all localities, there is a paper trail now. I know in Virginia that we have that. In all of the key swing states, that's the case. And in fact, all of the key swing states, this goes to the COVID-related question, all of the key swing states, and we're tracking 6, the 3 that President Trump won as a surprise, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, as well as the 3 widely considered swing states, Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida. All of those now have absentee ballot without an excuse. That is, in Virginia, if I wanted to go absentee, I have to give a reason why I can't be there on election day. That's actually just getting rewritten by the Virginia legislature. In those 6 swing states that I mentioned, anybody can vote by mail absentee. The question is, do they do even more enhanced efforts in advance of election day to spread that voting? And that's one thing that we're watching in all 6 of those swing states.
Great. This is from Lily Schroep, and she asked, to what do you attribute the relatively high level of turnover early in Trump's administration?
Well, there are 2 or 3 different dimensions of this. Look, the president said he wanted to be a disruptor. I think he brought in a relatively unconventional White House team and a relatively unconventional cabinet. Some people were really well qualified for these positions. Many of them were not, and they got into jobs that either the president felt they were in over their head or they felt they were in over their head. I could point to a few different examples, but in the one that I followed closely because I worked at the National Security Council was the National Security Advisor. Michael Flynn came in. Within 2 weeks, Michael Flynn was gone. Now, why was he gone? People talk about the conversations he had at the Russian embassy. That's really what led, and his characterization of those is what led to his departure. The true fact here is that you have to look a little bit further back here. Michael Flynn had never worked in a senior White House position before. And I think had he worked in there, he would have understood the political sensitivity of that job. He was essentially a senior intelligence officer used to talking directly with foreign governments. Now, he probably committed a major intelligence faux pas by having a conversation that was probably, in fact, it was listened to, not because they were tapping him, but because they were tapping the Russian embassy. So that's probably a function of him making a mistake. But the reason that he would have missed that mistake was, I think, he hadn't served in the pressure cooker of being in the White House, where one is exceedingly careful about every step one takes. And I think you can look at a number of the different officials that lasted for less than a year. They made some relatively rudimentary political mistakes. On top of that, you had a president who doesn't suffer mistakes gladly. As we all know from The Apprentice, he likes to fire people, and he did so with great frequency. Reince Priebus, who's somebody that I know through a number of different networks, worked perhaps over his head, worked exceedingly hard to try to manage and control this president. The president didn't want to be managed and controlled. He barely lasted 6 months. So, it's just, these are hard jobs to begin with. You had a boss with a short fuse, and you had people who came in who had not been in these kinds of positions before and probably just didn't understand the pressures involved.
Great, thank you. We had several questions submitted in advance, and also 1 or 2 that have come in that all ask for your predictions on who the vice presidential candidate will be.
Well, I think there's conventional wisdom, and then I think there are the outside the box choices. I'll go with the conventional wisdom, which is people think it should be somebody who has run for the job. And the biggest two reasons for that, and they're connected, are people who are quite sharp politically. Remember, Vice President Biden is a politician and has been a politician since he was 30 years old. What that means is, having served as vice president, he thinks that those political skills served him well. And therefore, the other people that ran for the presidency have some of those skills. And I think he's going to be sympathetic even to some who lost, who ran for the presidency and lost, because of course, he ran for the presidency and lost a couple times before he finally won the nomination. So there, people are pointing to Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris, and I think more of a dark horse here is Elizabeth Warren, mostly because she waited so long to endorse Vice President Biden. And I would say of those three, people tend to point to Amy Klobuchar as the lead candidate. I think the outside the box choices are former governors, also politicians, but haven't been through the intense vetting of the presidential run, where the national media spotlight is just excruciating. Every part of your background gets turned over. So there, people are looking at the current governor of Michigan, who has been handling the crisis quite well. I think one who tends to get less attention, but I think really would be a terrific choice, is Janet Napolitano, who just stepped down recently as the chancellor of the University of California system. But she has been the governor of Arizona and served as a cabinet secretary in the Obama administration for Homeland Security. So there you have a really seasoned pro who understands the federal agencies, who also understands state level government, both as a governor and in California running the biggest university system in the country. So those are some of the people that I'm looking at. I will tell you, anybody who thinks they know doesn't know. The vetting of vice presidential candidates always turns up things that people don't expect. And it really is a chemistry issue between the presidential candidate and the person that they pick.
Interesting, great. Thank you. We have a question that came in on the chat box, and it's related to one that was submitted in advance. The question that just came in is, how important is social media in this election? And the related question that was submitted in advance was based on the president's tweeting of the liberate, Minnesota liberate, Virginia liberate, was there any precedent or is there any analog even to a pre-social media age for that type of communication?
Look, I love this question. We have seen revolutions in media going back to the founding of the country. Remember the Jeffersonian Party, the Democratic Republicans, whatever you want to call them, they essentially waged a pamphlet war. And they learned the lessons of what it took, the Federalists, of which many of them were part, in getting the Constitution passed through the Federalist Papers. But they politicized that even further, defeating John Adams. People often forget that Andrew Jackson saw the combination of the steam engine plying the rivers and the printing press as really a threat to the Union, because abolitionist printing was starting to move pro-abolitionist newspapers and books from the North to the South on the river system. FDR and the fireside chats, when I worked on when I rearranged deck chairs on the Titanic of the Dukakis campaign, back then, if you were an advanced person, which I was, you had to put together a motorcade. And the standard operating procedure was always to get a station wagon with a drop-down tailgate so that a camera person could stand, and it had to have a roof rack, and a camera person would stand on the tailgate and hold the roof rack and film the candidate's limousine in case something happened to it. This is a legacy, of course, of John Kennedy being assassinated. And back in our day, the great new media was CNN. Suddenly the campaign was being broadcast 24/7, 365. So in addition to ABC, NBC, and CBS, we had to have a station wagon for CNN. There's always a revolution. And in the last presidency, the revolution was social media. I think social media will certainly play a role. The president uses it, but particularly in a COVID age, what I think you're going to see is a marrying of social media and the thing that we're doing. Video by social media. That is, I think, the technology of this age. And it's going to be targeted at turnout. The big difference between this election and the 2012 election, which Donald Trump pioneered and revolutionized, is that turnout may be more important than swing voters. 46% of the public, if turned out in the right states, becomes 49% of the public in a Wisconsin or a Michigan or a Pennsylvania. And if there are 2 or 3 very small minority candidates, which I expect there will be, if you get 49% in those states, you can win. And so if you take social media plus video, target it to your voters, get them mobilized to turn out, that can be the key to success.
Great. We have a 2004 Darden graduate who asked if what your read is on how much of Donald Trump's victory or loss would be tied to COVID-19. Is it the Trump card, if you will, or is that the economy, or is it a mix of factors as we go into the fall?
Well, I put it this way: it is, the ancient line is, it's the straw on the camel's, it's the final straw that breaks the camel's back, I think. And right now, I think you have to, if I were, one of the questions coming in is, if I was a betting man, who would I bet on? Right now, I think all indications are that this is Vice President Biden's to lose, and that he doesn't need to do much more than he's doing himself, other than get a good turnout operation. And the turnout operation for Vice President Biden is going to be all about COVID. So if the president loses, it will have been a referendum on COVID and the president's bad handling of it. If the president wins, it will be him saying that you can trust the economic recovery more to him than to Vice President Biden. He will start, the predicate will be, fewer people died than would have died had I not made these serious interventions that I made. But at some point, we have to get the economy starting again, both because people are losing jobs and we can't afford to lose jobs for this much longer, and other people are dying as a result of shutting down the economy. And he will provide evidence for that. The only reason that I want to caution saying that COVID is only the final answer and it would be the tipping point is the president's margin for error is so small. If you go back to those sometimes Trumpers, he needs to max out the sometimes Trumpers and get them to turn out. And it's all of the things that he did leading up to, and his explicit strategy to focus on his base leading up to Election Day, that has made COVID so salient. If 6 months ago or a year ago, after the 2018 midterms, if the president had consistently tacked back to the center and tried to woo centrist voters in a number of different ways, he might have won back some sometimes Trumpers and even some Republicans that defected to the Democratic side. But he has consistently not taken that fork in the road. And as a result, he is stuck with one thing, which is his base. And can he turn out the sometimes Trumpers who are willing to put up with the president's disruptive rhetoric and disruptive governing style because they see the president as the lesser of two evils?
Great. We had a question from a 1976 graduate of the college who wanted to know if you think Virginia will continue its trend as a blue state this year.
Yeah, I wish I remembered exactly how Larry Sabato, by the way, Larry was my professor and advisor when I was an undergrad, and we continue to do a number of different projects together. Here I'm just going off what I read from Larry and his team, which is, I think Larry tends to rate Virginia now as somewhere between leans Democratic and likely Democratic. And for me, and I'm pretty sure that Larry and his team view it this way, the turnout in the Democratic primary in Virginia is very indicative. There are a number of different signs that show that among other reasons, the reason that Vice President Biden won in such a lopsided fashion over Bernie Sanders was because a number of former Republicans have supported the president. And this is somewhat anecdotal, but I actually think it applies in big swaths. Remember, Virginia is one of the largest states of federal government employees. If you take the federal government employees that work in the various agencies in Washington that live in Northern Virginia, plus the defense establishment both in Northern Virginia and in Tidewater, plus the growing health establishment north of the south of the Potomac and inside the Beltway. If you take all of those federal government employees, even in the defense industries, the ones that used to be moderate Republicans, many of them have seen the president's attack on the so-called deep state as an attack on them. And many of them either are going to stay at home because they can't vote for a Democrat or have decided to vote Republican. Have decided to vote Democratic, even though they're traditionally Republican voters.
We'll have time for just a couple more. Another question that was submitted here tonight: what might be the impact on the election of the oil industry meltdown or troubles recently?
Well, look, typically dropping energy prices help boost the economy, and presidents want cheap gasoline in an election year. But this is a very different election year, and it's also a very different oil industry. So keep in mind now, for the first time going back to, I can't even remember when, the United States is no longer truly dependent on foreign oil, but that's back when oil was at $50 or $60 a barrel. And that's because of shale oil, both in North Dakota and in Texas. So the impact of low energy prices is actually negatively impacting a bunch of American states. Now, most of those states tend to be pretty consistently Republican states. Texas, I don't think in this election is going to flip Democratic, but people are saying 1 or 2 cycles out it could. And particularly if the president doesn't do anything to help the local oil industry, that could continue that trend. I think the biggest challenge is the crashing price of, and one thing the president has done, by the way, I think they just announced today, is given that the price of oil is so low, and in some markets people are actually paying people to take oil off their hands, the president will likely fill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve with cheap oil, which is, I think, a good thing for the country as a general matter. I think you want to have that in place in the event that there's a disruption in the flow of energy. So for the time being, I actually think that it's something that could potentially boost the economy, especially if the economy comes back online in the fall. That's likely to help the economy in many ways, but it does have some distinct negative impacts, particularly in those places that had been major producers of energy.
Great, and this will probably be, we'll probably have time for just this last question, but it was one submitted in advance. What might Joe Biden's platform include, or what could his campaign do to encourage bipartisanship in this election cycle?
This is a great question, and a more complicated one than someone might think. I think, and the biggest reason for that is, in most elections, the kinds of things the candidate is talking about is what they're going to do when they come into office. I think that we're going to be fighting this crisis right through most of the fall. So Vice President Biden is going to have to be talking about policies that are actually being debated at the current moment. In some ways, it's more analogous to the 2008 election when you had a financial crisis in the fall. And oddly there, it was a very strange circumstance, if you'll recall. President Bush, the Republican, was negotiating with Nancy Pelosi, then the Speaker of the House, to come up with the TARP legislation. The TARP was supported mostly by Democrats and not by what became the Tea Party on the Republican side. And so he was able to pass TARP mostly with Democratic support. And that included the Democratic candidate, Barack Obama, lobbying Democratic members of Congress to support a Republican president. And the Republican candidate, John McCain, not supporting the TARP and running against the sitting president of his own party. Here, you're going to have Vice President Biden, I think, actually having to be involved in supporting the policies that Republican cabinet officials are likely negotiating with Nancy Pelosi, because Nancy Pelosi is not likely to negotiate with President Trump himself. So it is going to be a complicated kabuki dance. I think the bigger places where Vice President Biden can signal what his administration after election and inauguration day will look like is what his cabinet looks like. There's a lot of talk that Vice President Biden will start to name his cabinet before election day, or at least point to the kinds of people who would be in his cabinet. Now, people don't tend to do this, but remember in the 2016 election, President Trump, then candidate Trump, did something that was quite unusual, which is he put forward a list of potential Supreme Court nominees and federal judges that he would nominate. And that ended up being a galvanizing figure on mobilizing his right wing. I think the way Vice President Biden can do the same thing is signal some of the centrists that would fill his cabinet as a way of mobilizing moderate voters to turn out. He's going to have to do some of that for his left. People are going to be looking to see whether Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or people in that part of the party would serve. But for every one of those people he names, my expectation is that he will name or point to a moderate who would serve in his cabinet. I think you will start to see both, oddly enough, President Trump and Vice President Biden talking about a big infrastructure plan as a second wave of employment that would happen after Election Day. I think it's an infrastructure plan, if it were passed now, would not kick in between now and Election Day. And so this is the kind of things both of them will signal. I think Vice President Biden, to try to distinguish himself, will focus some of that more on things like renewable energy and climate change to distinguish himself from President Trump. But remember, there's been growing moderate support. 65, 66% of the public now support aggressive actions on climate change. So I think infrastructure tied to renewable energy, particularly since we're all enjoying clear skies as a result of the shutdown of the economy over COVID, I think that actually could resonate not just with traditional Democratic voters, but even some moderate voters.
That's great. Well, Bill, we really want to thank you for taking this time to be with the UVA Club of Fairfield, Westchester, and several alumni, parent, and friend guests from across New England tonight. And I know that in this unusual period, the Miller Center is doing a ton of online programming, right? That if folks travel to your website, they can find out a little more about.
Yeah, we've been doing 2 webinars a week. We did one today, and all of the ones we've done in the past are available on our website. We did one today on healthcare, both in the United States and globally, featuring 2 UVA experts. We've got one coming up later this week featuring a guy named John Bridgeland, who is one of our senior fellows, was the domestic policy advisor for President Bush 43, and Tim Shriver. Together, they're co-chairing a bipartisan commission on public service, that is national service, and how to revitalize national service in the current era. And so we're doing about 2 a week until mid-May, and maybe a few over the summer, and then planning a robust fall programming schedule.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We hope those of you gathered tonight can join some of those programs and also future UVA Clubs programs and Office of Engagement programs. We are offering a host of things online during this time when we have to socially distant, even though we don't want UVA to be distant while we have to socially distance. So look for more opportunities, including online opportunities, and we're trying to send a digital digest that has opportunities from across grounds as well. So check your email for that. Bill, thank you so much. Ron and Fairfield Westchester Club Board, thank you for convening us tonight. And we hope everybody has a wonderful evening. Go Who's.
Michael, thank you. Ron, thanks everybody.
Thank you.